Salamander, or known as Life Force in North America, is a 1986 arcade spin-off to the legendary Gradius, which released a year prior to this game, both releasing by the legendary Konami. What set this spin-off game apart was two main differences: a much more easier power-up system, as well as introducing both horizontal and vertical scrolling stages, rather than the generic horizontal or vertical only formula, which to some degree was overdone at this point, and so having both of these scrolling actions in a single game was actually a refreshing concept, and was most memorable for having this. It came with 5 fairly sizable stages too. Now, to avoid confusion with the names used of this game, which admittedly can be very confusing, I will point out here again that when Salamander released in North America back in 1988, it changed names to Life Force, and so you likely would have seen Life Force on the arcade cabinets at the time. The story and levels were also slightly different too, with changes to the backgrounds as well as names of power-ups. Now, to make matters even more confusing, Japan actually re-released the game again and called it Life Force back in 1987. Some might argue that Life Force was more or less a revised version of the original Salamander game. There was even a version of Salamander for the MSX computer, which was a totally different game altogether. So yes, a very confusing history with the names of this game in many ways. The arcade game of Salamander, which I will likely refer to it as in this video, also had a very awesome 2-player co-op mode. A superb feature that made this game a little better was the fact that when our ship destroyed in the game, the player would then respawn from the same point, rather than having to restart from particular checkpoints in each area. So in comparison to Gradius, Salamander came with several refinements which made the gameplay much better in many ways. And especially for those of you who hated dying and having to start all over again, Salamander erased this annoyance. What it didn't remove was the insane difficulty level with Salamander. That stayed very much intact, and this game gets extremely difficult very quickly. Once we are hit, we lose all power-ups, but if you are in the position to do so, you can quickly collect them all after respawning. If you miss them and you happen to be playing at a stage with a ridiculous amount of enemies around you, then good luck with getting through it without losing a life. So today we are checking out every home conversion of Konami's masterpiece, that is Salamander, and assessing which version was the best for the home systems. I will note here that this is solely focused on the original runner releases, and will not be interested in homebrew versions or even super duper versions, which came years later. I am fairly convinced that children who had a copy of Salamander for Amstrad CPC wouldn't have been too pleased with this game. I mean, it scrolls fairly fast for a CPC game, but the gameplay itself isn't too spectacular by any means. There is some kind of input delay or so it seems when shooting here, or it could be that shooting is so slow paced that it feels that I need to wait in order for the Amstrad to catch up with things. There is no music here with this release, just very dull sound effects, which gives off a very mysterious echo sound after shooting. Moving the ship itself also seems fairly wooden. Most annoyingly with this 1990 conversion is that every time we die we have to go back to the start of the game, or at least back to a checkpoint. And of course, this was one of the great features with the arcades game. The checkpoint system wasn't a thing, and we continued from where we just died. This just takes away a massive portion of what this version is attempting to port across. And even more annoyingly, we don't get a chance to collect our power-ups either. When we die, we have to struggle through the toughest parts without any power-ups at all in some cases. I am also more than confident that this Amstrad's release is a lazy port of the next version. This is pretty much the same game as the previous Amstrad CPC game. We have an oversized ship here which is happy to get blown up easily by enemies and bullets that fly past us or into us. And there are times where we need to fit through small gaps with bullets coming towards us in all directions, as of which it's near impossible to avoid getting hit. The only reason I rank this above Amstrad's release is that the ZX Spectrum version do appear to run slightly faster, and we have a slight bit bit more maneuver room in the game, although not really much of it. But at least with those tricky situations with crowded areas, there is a whole 2% chance more of getting through it in one piece. The sound effects here are also fairly bland too, with no music, and again that annoying situation of once dying we have to start at the checkpoint again or right back to the start of the stage, which also totally strips us of power-ups or speed-ups. Both versions also contains that awful and very tacky looking border around the gameplay area. This and the Amstrad's version level design doesn't even resemble Salamander much, and speed-ups are not really a thing here either with these releases, until we get at least halfway through the stage, which makes both of these conversions even harder than they actually need to be. We had two slightly different releases of Salamander for the Nintendo's 8-bit console. This version for the NES released in 1988 and went by the name of Life Force for North America, and to make things even more confusing, the European release was known as Life Force Salamander. Now, if I'm honest, I didn't really think much of it compared to with another 8-bit version, which in my opinion was the best out of all the 8-bit systems. Controversial, sure, but this is how I roll. I found this a fairly slow version that flickers too. You can argue all you want in the comments because some NES purists likely will, but chill, this is not an official ranking, but my humble opinion and my ranking of a fairly old game. Japan had another version of the game in which Konami decided to just call it Salamander, which released in 1987. It's not strictly a direct version of Salamander as such, but rather a fusion of elements taken from Life Force as well as Salamander. There was also parts of the game which was removed with this Japanese release, such as some levels and even bosses, in order to fit new content onto the cartridge itself. Most notably here, in comparison with the North American release, is that the traditional Gradia style power-up bars can be seen on the HUD at the bottom of the screen. Finally, I made it to an 8-bit computer platform that actually resembles Salamander, and it was the C64. I wouldn't even say that this Commodore 64 conversion puts the other two 8-bit computer versions to shame. I would go as far as saying that this conversion literally laughs at both of the Spectrum and Amstrad releases, which tries their best to keep up with this by far superior C64 version. Now, most noticeably here, we no longer have the ridiculous border wrapped around the gameplay area. We have a proper full screen complete with a ship that is adequate in size and enough room in the gameplay area to fit a tank into if we wanted to. The music is top notch as well as the sound effects, and the scrolling movement is absolutely flawless. Hit collision detection is really good here too. When shooting enemies, they actually explode here rather than bullets going straight through them at times. When powering up here, we actually have bombs that travel across the rocky floors and blow up whatever gets in its way. When we die, we respawn from the same point we died. Yes, this is the top dog version. This is the version that you may have had whilst laughing at your friends Amstrad and Spectrum's versions. This is one of the Commodore 64's finest moments in history, and it released in 1988 by Ocean's Imagine label. The only issue with this port is that it actually had two missing stages from the arcade game, but considering the other two lousy 8-bit computer ports, then this version was light years ahead in every conceivable way. The PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16 received a very good conversion of Salamander in 1991, releasing by Konami themselves. It's pretty much an updated version of the arcade game, which at this point was around 5 years old, and so technology at this point allowed coders to do a fairly good home conversion of the game itself. The animations and sound are the biggest improvements here. We also have an option between beginner and expert modes too, both of which are ridiculously difficult even with the beginner mode. As good as the PC Engine release is, both visually and sound-wise, one very annoying problem that this game has is when we die, we had to go back to predefined checkpoints rather than dying and respawning instantly in the same place. Like most other releases, this can get very annoying when losing power-ups. It's particularly annoying when getting to the part of stage 1 where we need to shoot through walls. Normally this is fairly simple provided we have all the weapon upgrades, but if we die here, we had to go through again with very minimal power-ups. It's just so much more difficult. I really have no idea why Konami decided to use the checkpoint system here, but it's a real shame, because this would have been an arcade perfect version. We also don't get voice samples with this PC Engine release either. And for some honourable mentions, so first up we got the MSX version of Salamander, which completely changed most things. It's actually considered as a new adventure altogether. It contains a few bits and pieces from the arcade game, but this MSX 1987 release by Konami is generally just a new game altogether. From much longer stages than the arcade game had, we also get predefined checkpoints here, which is good. Once finishing level 2, the player can decide the order of the next 3 stages. The names of the ships are very different here too. 2 entirely new ships in fact. Instead of the Vic Viper and the Lord British Space Destroyer, they were replaced by ships known as Sabre Tiger as well as Thrasher. As for gameplay, it's not too bad. In typical MSX style, it does have issues scrolling, but that is strictly a hardware limitation of the machine itself. The Sega Saturn and PlayStation received a nice little compilation package in celebration of Salamander as an exclusive to Japan. This pack initially released for the Sega Saturn and then soon after released for the PlayStation. This Konami 1997 release included a port of Salamander as well as a 1996 sequel which was Salamander 2. It also had a port of Life Force included. 2007 also seen a nice little compilation for the PlayStation Portable, or PSP. Again, this was another Japanese exclusive, yet this offered more than the Salamander Deluxe Pack Plus for PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. This compilation included Salamander 1 and 2, the Japanese version of Life Force, Nemesis 2 aka Gradius 2 outside of Japan, and also, I'm gonna butcher this, Zzex aka Orius. A superb package if you had a PSP at the time and connected it with an AV cable to play on a bigger screen.
Destroy them all. The salt chamber is empty.
Owners of the powerhouse Sharp X68000 will have enjoyed a near-arcade perfect home conversion of Salamander on its release in 1988. It was developed by SPS and released by Sharp Corporation. SPS developed many quality titles for this machine such as The New Zealand Story and also Thunderblade to name a few. Both of these I've also covered in this arcade port series. This is one of the original releases of Salamander which included voice samples just like the arcade game itself, and also features a complete arcade experience in which when we die we have no annoying checkpoint system, but we can rather instantly respawn to the place of where we just died. Admittedly, the game does tend to slow down when the screen gets too busy, but I would have preferred this to the PC Engine's version where having to lose weapon upgrades and speed ups were lost when dying, which was very frustrating. The music and sound effects in general with this port is just spot on, it really is. Now, some will argue that many people never had a Sharp X68000 outside of Japan in 1988, but let's just remember that my channel was watched all around the world, and to exclude a computer that had a version of this game wouldn't be right. And you could argue that maybe it would seem odd if I didn't include the awesome Commodore 64 version for a similar situation. And that's it for today's ranking the very confusing history in terms of naming versions of Salamander. So, of course, very controversial video where I've placed the Commodore 64 version, and I know there's going to be a lot of haters where I put the NES versions of this game, but like I say during this video, that was my preference, and by no means is this any form of official ranking of Salamander or Life Force, just my opinion, and just like always, please respect my opinion of that. Anyways, which version did you grow up playing? Did you have that very pitiful Amstrad or even ZX Spectrum version of the game? If so, you truly have my sympathy. They just weren't too good at all. And remember, I've also done the Gradius ranking video too, so do check that one out. Anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching.
Multiple. Multiple.